What if I told you that a life without fast food air conditioning or smartphones could still be lived, though perhaps a bit more, let's say, challenging? Let's journey into the tough, yet strangely admirable world of a medieval peasant. It's easy to look back at history and imagine the past as a simpler time, but in reality, life in the Middle Ages wasn't simple at all. In fact, it was a constant battle. A battle not only against the elements, harsh winters, and unpredictable weather, but also against the weight of relentless physical labor. For the medieval peasant, every day was a new chapter of struggle and survival. The peasant's world was defined by simplicity, but not in the way we often romanticize it today. It wasn't about escaping modern complexities. It was about survival in a world where every moment was a matter of life and death. Unlike today, where most of us wake up to a warm bed, a hot shower, and a cup of coffee, a medieval peasant's morning was far less glamorous. Imagine waking up at the crack of dawn, the chill of the early morning air creeping through the cracks in the walls of your humble cottage. You don't have the luxury of staying in bed for an extra hour or hitting the snooze button. Your body is your alarm, and it knows the day has already begun. The first task of the day isn't checking your phone or making your favorite breakfast. It's pulling yourself out of a rough bed made of straw and wool with aching joints from the day before. Every movement is a reminder that your body is your most valuable asset, and today, like every other day, it's going to be put to the test. The life of a peasant wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about comfort. It was about getting by, one back-breaking task at a time. For most peasants, the day didn't start with the sound of a gentle alarm or the comforting hum of a modern coffee maker. Instead, it began with the noise of the world around them. Animals stirring in the barn, the soft rustle of wind in the trees, and the distant sounds of nature waking up just like they were. There was no rush to meet deadlines, no meetings to attend, no emails to check. Instead, there was just the endless, monotonous grind. A peasant's day began with chores. And by chores, I mean a whole day of work, from sunup to sundown, often in the fields, often alone, often with very little reprieve. This was the medieval reality. There was no going to the gym to get some steps in. The steps were part of their life, and there was no fitness tracker to measure their calorie burn or progress. Every step, every moment spent in the fields was a reminder of the life they were stuck in. For most of us today, it's easy to take for granted how simple things are. We have food delivered right to our doors. We can adjust the temperature of our homes with the touch of a button. But back then, peasants lived with uncertainty. They lived without the luxury of refrigeration, so food was scarce preserved only through drying, salting, or fermenting. They didn't have the joy of browsing the internet for a new recipe or ordering takeout when they didn't feel like cooking. If the harvest wasn't good, they might go hungry for weeks. If the weather was bad, it could wipe out their crops entirely, leaving them with nothing to fall back on. Survival was not just about hard work. It was about luck, fate, and circumstance. But here's the thing. Despite all the hardships, there's something strangely beautiful about the peasant's life. It was a life of simplicity, certainly, but also one of incredible resilience. Every day was a reminder of how much strength it took to survive. There was no option to quit or take a break. The peasants didn't have that luxury. They had to keep going, no matter what. Each sunrise brought another opportunity for hard work, another chance to persevere. As we explore this world, take a moment to reflect on how far we've come. It's easy to forget in our modern lives full of conveniences and comforts how much of it we owe to those who lived before us. Without the work of the peasants who toiled in the fields, without the sacrifices of those who went without in order to provide, we might not have the ease we experience today. Their struggles were not in vain. They laid the groundwork for the world we live in now. And yet, even with all the struggles, even with the absence of the luxuries we now enjoy, the medieval peasant still found ways to survive and sometimes even thrive. As we move forward, let's take a look at just how these peasants spent their days, starting with the first moments of their day waking up. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. And that's more than many of us can say. As the first rays of sunlight begin to break through the dense forest and creep across the land, the medieval peasant's day begins. Not with the soothing buzz of a modern alarm clock or the warm glow of a bedside lamp, but with the sounds of the world around them. Birds chirp in the trees, and the animals in the barn begin to stir, signaling the start of another day. It's early, very early, far earlier than most of us are accustomed to in our comfy temperature-controlled homes. If you were a peasant, your bed was a far cry from the soft memory foam you might be familiar with today. No, the peasant's bed was likely made of rough woolen blankets and a mattress filled with straw. The comfort was minimal, but it did its job just enough to get a little rest before starting the grueling day ahead. Still, waking up wasn't exactly refreshing. If anything, it was a shock to the system, as your body ached from the previous day's hard work. The fatigue weighed heavy on your limbs, and the promise of another exhausting day loomed large. Yet despite the discomfort, there was no time to linger in bed. The peasant knew that the early hours were precious. Every moment wasted was a moment lost. So the day had to begin. Whether your body was ready or not, you'd pull yourself out of bed, probably with a few groans and stretches, and immediately face the reality of the day ahead. First, there would be the basic task of personal hygiene. In modern life, most of us are used to stepping into a shower with hot water flowing freely from the tap. For the medieval peasant, however, things were much simpler, perhaps too simple for comfort. The bathroom was a chamber pot, emptied in the morning, and the washing of hands or faces might have involved a cold splash of water from a wooden bucket or a small wash basin. To make matters worse, in medieval society, personal hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority. People didn't bathe. Often, sometimes, only a handful of times a year. So it's safe to say that the concept of freshening up was, well, not a luxury available to them, but there was something strangely comforting in that, wasn't there? No stressing over skincare routines or the pressure to look perfect all the time, just raw, unpolished life. Once you've managed to rouse yourself from your cold bed and maybe wipe a bit of sleep from your eyes, it's time to prepare for breakfast. If you're lucky, there might be a bit of leftover bread from yesterday, or perhaps some porridge if you had the energy to make it. For the medieval peasant, food was a matter of survival, not indulgence. There were no cereal aisles with 100 different choices. No endless bags of chips or pre-packaged pastries. What you had was what you had, and that was often just enough to get you through another morning of hard labor. On a good day, there might be eggs from the chickens, or perhaps some cheese if the family was fortunate enough to own a cow. But if the harvest had been poor, or the weather too harsh, breakfast could be little more than a few crumbs of bread and a sip of water. There was no such thing as an Instagram-worthy breakfast. No elaborate avocado toasts or perfectly brewed lattes. It was functional food, nothing more, nothing less. Then once your breakfast was done, it was time to dress in whatever rough clothes you could muster. Peasant clothing was usually made of wool or linen, simple and sturdy, designed for practicality rather than fashion. No fitted jeans or designer jackets here, just basic garments to protect you from the elements as you ventured out into the world. But before you could even think about leaving the house, there were the animals to tend to. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats. These animals were not just companions, but vital to the peasant's survival. They provided milk, meat, and eggs, as well as wool and leather. Their care was as essential as the work in the fields, and it came with its own set of challenges. There's a quiet kind of rhythm to life on a farm, and if you were a medieval peasant, you'd have become intimately familiar with it. The morning tasks were often repetitive and monotonous, but they were necessary: milking the cows, feeding the pigs, collecting the eggs. These were just the start. If you were fortunate enough to have land, there would also be crops to check on, to make sure that everything was growing as it should. As you stand there, tending to the animals, there's a strange feeling of peace in the air. It's early, the world is still quiet, and the only sounds are the lowing of cows and the clucking of chickens. Yet there's always a subtle undercurrent of anxiety. You can't help but wonder, will the harvest be enough this year? Will the weather hold? Can you keep the animals healthy and fed? Each question is a heavy weight on the mind, but you push forward because you have no choice. The day must continue, and so like clockwork, your day begins. It's not glamorous. It's not easy. It's a life of quiet, relentless work. But there's something raw and real about it. Something that in today's world we might find grounding. As you look out over the fields, you might find yourself quietly appreciating the simple, undistracted beauty of the world around you. There's no rush, no deadlines, just the steady rhythm of life, unfolding one task at a time. But as the day unfolds, so too does the knowledge that there is still so much to be done. And so, with a final glance at the animals and a breath of fresh morning air, you gather your strength, preparing to face the day ahead. One of backbreaking labor, yes, but also one of quiet resilience. Now that the day has officially begun, it's time for the real work to start. Forget the luxury of having a break for coffee or scrolling through your phone for the latest news. The medieval peasant's day was a relentless series of tasks, each one more demanding than the last, and it all began in the fields. As you step outside, the air feels crisp against your face, the scent of the earth and freshly turned soil greeting you. It's a feeling that is both invigorating and daunting. There's a sense of freedom in the vastness of the land, but it is a freedom that comes at a cost measured in sweat, aches, and exhaustion. The field before you is no neatly plowed garden with rows of vegetables lined up in perfect order. No, this is rugged, untamed land requiring your full attention. The plow you wield is made of wood, old and worn, its metal blade dulled by constant use. Your oxen, your constant companions, are hitched to it, ready to begin the slow, grueling process of turning the soil. Unlike today, where we can hop into a tractor or use automated equipment to make the work easier, the medieval peasants' tools were crude, simple, and labor-intensive. A wooden plow, pulled by oxen, was the height of agricultural technology, and it still required a great deal of effort to operate. Every step in the field demanded muscle patience and persistence. There was no auto steer to guide you, no GPS to tell you when you were perfectly aligned. Every line had to be traced by hand, each furrow a testament to your effort. As the oxen pull the plow through the soil, your hands grip the wooden handles tightly, and your back begins to ache. The hours stretch before you. Endless, relentless hours. You've worked in these fields for so many years that your body is used to the strain, but that doesn't make it any easier. Every movement, every turn of the plow is a reminder that life in the medieval world was hard and that you are at the mercy of the land itself. But it's not just the physical toll of the work that makes this life so challenging. It's the emotional burden too. Every crop you plant, every seed you sow is a gamble. Will there be enough rain? Will the soil nourish your crops? Or will they wither in the heat? As the sun beats down on your shoulders, you know that you've done all you can. There is no backup plan, no second shift to take over if things go wrong. The harvest will be what it will be, and there's nothing you can do to control it. After a long day in the fields, you might head back to the barn to tend to the animals. The chickens, cows, and pigs aren't just creatures to admire. From a distance, they are your livelihood. Every peasant understood the critical role animals played in their survival. The cows provided milk for the family, and the chickens gave eggs. The pigs were a potential source of meat. Though slaughtering them came with its own set of challenges, there were no fancy animal care routines or organic feed, just the basics of feeding and caring for them to make sure they stayed alive and productive. Milking the cows, for instance, wasn't the simple, sterile process we might imagine today. It was a sweaty, time-consuming task. The cows were sometimes stubborn, and there were no modern-day milking machines to make it easier. Every morning and evening, the peasant would sit on a small stool, hands aching, as they carefully milked the animals by hand. It's a task that requires patience and perseverance, traits that every medieval peasant had in abundance. It's easy to see how this life would wear on a person. The days are long and the work is never ending. But in between the sweat and the aches, there are moments that make the struggle worthwhile. When the first shoots of your crops break through the soil, there's a feeling of quiet triumph. When the cows give milk and the chickens lay eggs, there's a sense of accomplishment. It's a hard life, but it's also a life full of purpose. For a modern-day observer, this might seem like an exhausting way to live, working from sunrise to sunset with little rest. But for the peasant, it was the only way of life they knew. There was no time for daydreaming or planning for the future. The present moment was all-consuming, and every hour spent working was an investment in the hope of a better tomorrow. Yet despite the hardship, there's a kind of beauty in the simplicity of it all. There's a certain peace that comes from a life so connected to nature, a life where every action is grounded in the rhythms of the earth. The peasant didn't need a gym membership to stay in shape. The fields were their gym. They didn't need an app to track their steps. Every step was counted, every task contributing to the greater good of survival. And perhaps in some small way, the medieval peasant had it better than we do. In a world filled with distractions, constant noise, and the pressure to do more, they lived in a simpler reality, one where every action had a clear purpose. Sure, it was tough and the risks were high, but it was a life of clarity. The peasants' work was visible, tangible, and meaningful. They could see the fruits of their labor with each passing season. As you step back into the barn to feed the animals and prepare for another long day tomorrow, you begin to appreciate the raw honesty of it all. The modern world may be full of luxuries, but perhaps in the quiet moments between the work, the peasants understood something we've lost: the simple joy of a day well spent. As the day slowly winds down and you pause to catch your breath, it's easy to feel the weight of the physical labor start to settle deep into your bones. But there's something more than just the exhaustion that begins to creep in. It's the emotional toll, a silent undercurrent that follows you throughout the day, often unspoken and largely unnoticed. For the medieval peasant life wasn't just about working from sunrise to sunset. It was about surviving in a world where every day brought the same struggles, and those struggles often came without any relief. There were no weekends to look forward to, no vacations to escape the daily grind. Life was a monotonous cycle, and it could feel as though you were living within a narrow tunnel with very little opportunity to step outside of it and find joy. You were never truly alone, but in many ways, you were isolated. Life in a medieval village was often spent in small, close-knit communities. Everyone knew everyone, and every person had a role to play. The work was communal, but the solitude was often overwhelming. There were no social clubs, no places to hang out after work, no moments of leisurely conversation over a cup of coffee or a drink with friends. The closest you might come to a night out was gathering with your neighbors at the local church for a sermon, or perhaps a rare festival or holiday. But in between these rare moments of togetherness, you are often left to the quiet hum of your own thoughts. And what thoughts would those be? They would be the worries of the future, the fears that plague every peasant's mind. Will the crops grow this year? Will the animals stay healthy? Will we have enough food to get through the winter? And even more pressing, the thought that one day you might not be able to continue the backbreaking work that has been your life's rhythm. In today's world, we have the luxury of distraction. We can check our phones, watch television, or chat with friends. Whenever we feel isolated, we can turn to books, podcasts, or social media to fill the silence. But in medieval times, silence could feel deafening, with no entertainment to speak of. The peasants often spent their evenings in solitude or with family. But this only deepened the sense of isolation. Even in a crowded village, it was easy to feel like an island. And then there was the emotional toll of family life. A peasant's family was their greatest treasure, but also their greatest source of stress. Raising children in a world so full of uncertainty was no easy task. The medieval peasant knew that a child's life was fragile, and a single illness, a bad harvest, or a misstep could take everything away. There were no modern medicines or vaccinations to protect the little ones. Illnesses that we now take for granted were often fatal, and the constant fear of losing a child or spouse loomed over every family. In fact, children in medieval times faced a tough life from the very beginning. High infant mortality rates meant that most families lost at least one or two children before they reached adulthood. This constant cycle of loss made life all the more difficult, and the emotional toll of losing a child, or even just worrying about the health of your family, was a weight that could never be shaken off. When you did gather with others, it was often in the context of hard work or religious observance. The church played a crucial role in the life of a medieval peasant, providing both spiritual solace and a sense of community. The church was a place where you could find both comfort and a shared bond with those who were also toiling away in the fields. The Sunday service was one of the few times peasants had the opportunity to gather with their neighbors for anything other than work. But even the church, with its promises of solace, couldn't erase the isolation you felt in the quiet moments of your life. When the sun set and the village grew still, it was just you, your family, and your thoughts. For many, this solitude could feel oppressive. Life was defined by the endless tasks ahead and the pressure to keep going, with little to no reward except for the satisfaction of another day survived. Sometimes even your closest neighbor might not understand the depths of your struggle. After all, they were in the same boat. Everyone was struggling, but that didn't mean the loneliness didn't seep in. There were no therapists to talk to, no way to express the emotional exhaustion that came with the never-ending cycle of work. So the peasant buried it deep and kept going. There's a strange irony in this, isn't there? We often think of loneliness as a modern affliction, something caused by technology, social media, or a lack of human connection. But for the medieval peasant, the absence of these distractions didn't make loneliness any easier to bear. In fact, it might have made it even harder because there was no way to escape it. No podcast to listen to, no books to read, no television to turn on. Just the sounds of the world around you and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life lived in repetition. But there was strength in that. Perhaps it wasn't the kind of strength we think of when we imagine the bravado of modern life. No, it was quieter. It was the kind of strength that kept the peasant going day after day, even when the future seemed uncertain. It was the strength of living with hardship, of surviving in a world that often felt indifferent to your struggles. And perhaps, in some ways, that quiet, unspoken resilience is what truly defined the medieval peasant. The ability to keep moving forward, even when everything else seemed to stand still. As the day winds down and the last of the sunlight fades away, there's a certain stillness in the air. The work doesn't stop with the setting sun. It simply shifts. But there's another shift in life that comes with the change of seasons. And this shift is where the real challenge lies. For a medieval peasant, the year was not divided into the cozy holiday-filled segments that we now enjoy. Instead, the year was shaped by the changing seasons, each one bringing with it its own set of challenges. The seasons didn't simply mark the passage of time, they determined the course of your entire life. Imagine for a moment that it's winter. The days are short, the nights long and cold. The wind howls through the cracks in your cottage walls, and the snow piles up in heavy drifts, isolating you from the world. The land is frozen, the fields barren, and all that remains of the summer's work are memories of crops that have either been harvested or are slowly rotting in the cold. The animals huddle in the barn, their breath fogging in the chill. And every step you take outside is met with the biting sting of the winter air. Winter for the medieval peasant was not just a season, it was a trial. The physical toll of working through the cold was immense. But it was the uncertainty that made it truly difficult. You never knew if the winter would be mild or harsh, and there was no way to prepare for it beyond what you could gather in the autumn. Any hope of surviving the cold months rested on the harvest from earlier in the year. If the crops had been good, there would be enough food to carry you through. If not, well, you'd have to rely on whatever you could forage, barter, or ration. The scarcity of food during the winter months was not just an inconvenience, it was a matter of survival. You couldn't simply pop down to the store to buy more if the harvest had been poor, or the animals weren't well fed. The winter would feel even longer, a never-ending stretch of hunger and hardship. The cold seeping into your bones made every task more difficult, and every moment felt like an eternity. There was no escape. There were no heaters, no thick woolen blankets, and no fireplace big enough to ward off the chill that seemed to permeate everything. But the medieval peasant was no stranger to this struggle. They had learned through generations how to cope with the harsh realities of winter. The community would gather together to share what they had, pooling resources to ensure everyone made it through. And while it was hard, there was also a sense of camaraderie in those moments of collective survival. If one family had a good stockpile of grain, they might share it with their neighbors. If someone had a surplus of meat or preserved food, it would be distributed to those in need. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a system that allowed the village to survive year after year. The challenge of winter, however, wasn't just physical. There was a deep emotional toll that came with the isolation of those long months. The days were short, the nights long, and the darkness could feel overwhelming. There was little to do but wait for the spring thaw, a waiting that often felt like an eternity. The monotony of life in winter could take its toll on the spirit, and the quiet isolation could bring about a kind of mental exhaustion that was just as draining as the physical labor of the fields. But then, as the seasons inevitably change, spring arrives. The days grow longer, the air warmer, and slowly the earth begins to awaken from its long winter slumber. The thawing ground signals the return of hope, the promise that with the arrival of spring comes the possibility of a bountiful harvest. Spring for the medieval peasant was a time of renewal, but it was also a time of tension. The planting season was crucial. If the crops were going to be good, everything had to be done right. Every seed had to be planted at just the right time, and the weather had to cooperate. A late frost, a drought, or a sudden downpour could ruin everything. There was no way to control the weather, so the peasant's fate was largely left in the hands of nature. The work was grueling. Days spent in the fields, plowing, sowing, and planting would quickly turn into weeks, then months. Every minute spent working the land was an investment in the hope of a good harvest. Yet despite the hard work and uncertainty, there was something hopeful about spring. The ground, once frozen and barren, began to show signs of life. Green shoots broke through the earth, and with them, the promise of future food, and then came the harvest, a brief but crucial moment of triumph. The crops you had labored over for months would finally be gathered. The hard work of the summer was paid off in the fruits of your labor. But there was little time to bask in the joy of the harvest. After all, harvest time was another kind of struggle in itself. It was an all-hands-on-deck situation. Everyone in the community had to work together to bring in the crops before the first frost hit. For a moment, there was relief. The harvest was in, and there would be enough food for the winter. The anxiety of the cold months ahead could be put aside at least for a time, but that relief was fleeting. The cycle would start again, and the hard labor of the fields would resume. Winter, spring, summer, fall, the seasons defined the rhythm of the peasant's life, and each one brought its own set of hardships and triumphs. But even in the hardest of times, there was something steady about the seasons, a cycle that reminded the peasant that life, in all its difficulty, was a series of moments that kept turning, kept moving forward. As the seasons change, so too does the nature of the peasant's life. The rhythm of planting and harvesting, the struggle of surviving winter, and the hope that springs eternal with every new dawn are all framed within a broader system. A system that determines the very boundaries of the peasant's life. The medieval peasant wasn't just living off the land. They were living within the constraints of the feudal system, a rigid social structure that shaped every part of their existence. Imagine for a moment being a peasant in a medieval village. Your life is hard. Yes, every day is filled with physical labor. But the real weight of your life isn't just in the backbreaking work. It's in the knowledge that you are tied to the land. You don't own it. You don't control it. You are bound to it like the soil itself. Your livelihood depends not only on your own hard work, but on the demands of your Lord, the man who owns the land and, in theory, owns you. The feudal system wasn't just about kings and nobles. It was about an entire social hierarchy that kept everyone in their place. At the top were the lords, the wealthy landowners who held power over vast swathes of land. Below them, in a vast sea of toil and sweat, were the peasants, the serfs, the ones who worked the land, who lived on it, and who would likely never leave it. The relationship between the lord and the peasant was one of dependency. The peasants worked the land, and in return, the lord provided them with protection, land to work, and a place to live. Though the conditions were far from generous. But even within this system, there was little room for freedom. The peasants didn't have the right to pack up and leave whenever they wanted. The land didn't belong to them. It belonged to the Lord. If the Lord decided to raise the rent or change the terms of the agreement, the peasants had no choice but to comply. They could appeal, of course, but that rarely did much good. It was the Lord's word that ruled the land, and there was little anyone could do to challenge it. The work itself was the price of survival. In exchange for the right to live on the land, peasants were required to work the Lord's fields, fields that were often far more productive than their own small plots of land. The Lord would take a portion of the harvest, which meant that the peasant had to work, not only for their own survival, but also for the benefit of someone else. It wasn't a fair system. The peasant was stuck in a cycle of endless labor with no hope of breaking free. Even the homes that peasants lived in were not truly their own. They might have a small cottage, perhaps made of mud and straw, but the land beneath their feet was owned by the Lord. In theory, this system existed to protect the peasant. The Lord was responsible for defending the land, offering protection from invaders or bandits, but in practice, this protection rarely felt comforting. The peasants were often at the mercy of the Lord's whims, but there were, of course, moments of resistance. The peasants didn't simply accept their fate without protest. When the conditions became unbearable, when taxes were too high or demands for labor were too extreme, there were uprisings. Rebellions, though rare, did occur, but they were often suppressed swiftly and mercilessly. In the end, the system was designed to maintain the status quo. The peasants worked, and the lords thrived. One of the few joys of the peasant's life, aside from the occasional break to attend church or a rare festival, came in the form of family. Family was everything. In a world defined by work and hardship, the strength of the family unit was a source of comfort and at times resilience when you were bound to the land, tied by the chains of the feudal system. It was your family that helped you endure. Together, the family worked to ensure that everyone survived. Yet this connection to family could also be another reminder of the peasant's place in the system. Children, even from a young age, were expected to contribute to the work. There was no opportunity for play or education in the way we know it today. Children didn't have time for school. They had to work the land just like their parents. They learned the value of hard work early often by picking up tools, feeding the animals, or helping with the harvest. It wasn't a carefree childhood. It was a childhood shaped by necessity, where survival depended on contributing to the family's effort. Despite the grueling nature of life, there was still something somewhat comforting about the familiarity of the feudal system. The peasants might not have had the ability to rise in society, but they did have a certain predictability to their lives. The work would always be there. The seasons would always come and go, and the cycle would repeat. There was no need to worry about what came next. At least not in the same way we do today. The peasants lived their lives based on what they knew, working day after day, year after year in the same way their ancestors had. This predictability, though, didn't make life any easier. It simply meant that the peasant knew their place in the world. The stability of their position, in a strange way, allowed them to cope with the monotony of their daily existence. They knew that life wasn't going to change, at least not for them, but they could still find moments of peace in that understanding. As we reflect on the feudal system and the peasant's place in it, it's hard not to draw comparisons with our own lives. Today, we have the luxury of mobility, the ability to change careers, move to new cities, or try our hand at a variety of pursuits. The peasants, however, had no such luxury. The land was their prison, and their fate was tied to it, as well as to the will of their lord. But there is also a certain admiration to be found in the resilience of the medieval peasant. They endured a life of hardship, yes, but they did so with an incredible sense of duty, perseverance, and endurance. The feudal system might have kept them in their place, but it never broke their spirit. As the seasons roll by and the work of the fields continues, the peasant's body slowly begins to bear the brunt of a life lived in labor. Every day is a test of endurance, and the physical toll is inexorable each year. A new layer of strain each day. Another reminder that the body, no matter how strong, will eventually wear out. The medieval peasant lived a life of constant movement, of lifting, pulling, bending, and toiling. And with each movement, the toll became more apparent. You wake up each day knowing that your body will be your greatest tool. It's the only thing you can rely on. There's no modern technology to help you with the work. No machines or conveniences to lighten the load. The plow, the shovel, the sickle. These are your instruments of survival. But for all their utility, they are also the instruments of your undoing. Your hands, calloused and rough from years of gripping tools, begin to ache with the very act of picking them up. Your back, stiff from the constant bending and lifting protests with every turn of the soil. The aches are a constant companion, but they're also part of the life you know. Pain, it seems, is just another part of the day's work. Imagine for a moment the physicality of it all. You start the day by lifting heavy sacks of grain, carrying them from the storage area to the fields. Each sack is a weight that pulls at your muscles, your body bending under its load. There's no choice but to lift it, to carry it, to keep going. The sun beats down, and your skin begins to burn from hours of exposure. Sweat drips from your brow, stinging your eyes, but you keep moving. You don't stop. There's no time for rest. Even as your legs begin to ache and your arms feel like they might give way, you keep moving. The work must be done. Then there's the toll on your back. Every day, you bend down to tend to the crops, to gather them, to plant them. The constant bending is not just uncomfortable, it's painful. The muscles in your back are stretched to their limit, your spine bending in ways it wasn't designed for. The weight of your labor presses down on you in a way that becomes second nature. The pain becomes part of the rhythm of your day, just another challenge to overcome. But it's a challenge that doesn't go away. As the days drag on, the aches in your back begin to turn into something more permanent. They're no longer just the aches of a hard day's work. They're the aches of a body that has been stretched, pulled, and worn thin over the years. And then there are your feet, long hours spent walking through the fields, often barefoot, or in rough, poorly made shoes, lead to blisters, calluses, and aching joints. Every step is a reminder that your body is breaking down. The earth beneath you is unforgiving, and your feet, with every step, take the brunt of it. They ache, they crack, they bleed, but you have no choice but to keep going. The work doesn't stop, and neither do you. Your body grows weary, but the demands of the land don't care. There's always more to do, more to harvest, more to plant. The cycle of labor is unending, and it continues year after year. Even as the years take their toll, there is no time to rest. Rest is a luxury that the peasant simply cannot afford. Every day is a battle against the body's limits, against the natural forces of wear and tear. The bones ache, the muscles strain, but there is always more to do. And then, as you reach your middle years, the weariness becomes even more apparent. The hands that once gripped tools with ease now shake with the effort. The back that once bent without hesitation now groans in protest. The body once strong and agile is starting to break down. And yet, the work doesn't stop. There is no pension, no retirement plan for the medieval peasant. The work continues until the body can no longer do it. But even then, the cycle continues for the next generation. The children take on the burden that their parents once carried. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this physical toll is how little it is acknowledged. In the modern world, we are quick to recognize the effects of hard work. We have healthcare chiropractors, physical therapists, and even the occasional massage to ease the tension and pain we accumulate over time. We talk openly about our aches and pains, and we seek relief when we need it. But for the medieval peasant, there was no such luxury. Pain was just a part of life, something to endure. It was the price of survival, and there was no other option. But even in the face of this physical weariness, there is something admirable about the peasants' resilience. They endured the pain because they had to. They pushed through the exhaustion because their families depended on them. The suffering was a quiet, constant companion, but it never stopped them. They worked until they could work no longer, and even then they found strength in their suffering. It's a resilience that in some ways feels foreign to us today in our world of comfort and ease. The physical toll of the medieval peasant's life is a reminder of how much we take for granted. We complain about our sore muscles after a trip to the gym or a long day at work, but we have access to rest, recovery, and comfort. The peasant had none of these things. Their physical pain was simply the price of living, a price they paid every single day. Despite the backbreaking work, the relentless seasons, and the physical toll that life exacted, there was one constant that kept the medieval peasant going: family. In the harsh, unyielding world of the peasant, family wasn't just a source of emotional support, it was survival. The strength of the family unit was what made it possible to endure the hardships of everyday life. In many ways, family was both the greatest comfort and the greatest responsibility. The peasant's family was everything. Without them, survival in a world as grueling as medieval life would have been nearly impossible. Whether it was working the fields, caring for animals, or gathering firewood, every member of the family played a role in the daily grind. Children, even from a young age, were taught to work. There was no time for play in the way we understand it today. Every moment was spent preparing for the future, ensuring that everyone's basic needs were met. But this responsibility didn't just fall on the shoulders of the parents. The children, too, had a role to play. They weren't seen as passive members of the family, waiting to grow up before they could contribute. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to help with the chores. At the age of 6 or 7, they were already helping with small tasks, feeding animals, gathering firewood, or helping with the harvest. By their early teens, they were fully involved in the labor of the fields, just as their parents were. Imagine for a moment the tight bond that would form between family members in such a setting. There were no distractions, no school, no entertainment, no social media. Life was focused entirely on the work of survival. This meant that families were bound together, not just by love, but by necessity. Parents and children worked side by side, sharing the labor of everyday life. There were no luxuries in the medieval peasant's home, but there was a deep sense of purpose in what they did together. However, While the family was essential to survival, it also carried the weight of emotional strain. Raising children in the medieval world was not easy. The infant mortality rate was high, and many families lost children before they reached adulthood. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no modern medicine to protect the young. Illness could strike without warning, and a single misstep could be fatal. The constant worry that a child might fall ill or succumb to an accident must have weighed heavily on every parent's mind. In many ways, the emotional toll of raising a family was just as difficult as the physical labor. But in the medieval peasant's world, there was no time for grief. No space to mourn for long. Life went on. The work didn't stop for sickness or sadness. If a child fell ill, the family would do their best to care for them. But in the end, there was no control over whether they survived or not. Death, while always present, was never easy to accept, but it was a reality that peasants had no choice but to face. As children grew older, they would often become an extension of their parents' labor force, taking on even more responsibility. And this didn't just involve the manual labor of farming. It was also about ensuring that the family stayed together, that each person did their part to keep the household running smoothly. The bond between siblings was crucial, as they would often have to work together in the fields, in the home, and in the care of animals. Despite the difficulties, there were moments of joy in the family's life. The medieval peasant might not have had the luxury of grand holidays or celebrations, but they did celebrate togetherness in their own way. The family came together for meals, however humble, and the simple act of eating together helped to strengthen the bonds of love and support. There might be an occasional feast, a community celebration, or a religious holiday to look forward to. In those moments, the burden of the everyday work could be set aside, and the family could come together to enjoy each other's company. But these moments were fleeting. The reality of medieval life was that after the brief respite, the family would return to their roles, each person working together to ensure the survival of the group. The sense of duty to family was all-encompassing. Parents worked for their children's future, and children worked for their family's survival. There was a sense of pride in knowing that each person's efforts contributed to the well-being of the whole. In some ways, this deep sense of familial responsibility may have created a form of emotional fortitude. There was no room for selfishness or individual desires. The family's survival depended on every member working together. This created a resilience that modern society sometimes lacks. A resilience born from the necessity of surviving as a unit. But there were also challenges that came with this tight-knit structure. The family could become a source of pressure, as everyone's survival was intertwined. If one member of the family struggled, whether due to illness, misfortune, or weakness, it impacted everyone. The peasant's life was not just about working for oneself. It was about working for the collective good of the family. And the weight of that responsibility could sometimes feel overwhelming. Despite this, the sense of love and duty between family members was unwavering. There was no luxury of independence, but there was a deep connection to each other. In the face of hardships that modern society can hardly comprehend, the peasant's family was a source of both strength and vulnerability. It was a bond forged in the fires of necessity, one that carried them through the darkest times And so even as the physical toll of medieval life wore down the body, the emotional strength of the family unit helped to keep the peasant going. The love shared within the family, the sense of mutual dependence, was the fuel that kept them moving forward, no matter how hard the world around them became. As we take a step back and reflect on the life of a medieval peasant, it's difficult not to feel a deep sense of gratitude for the comforts and conveniences that define our modern existence. Our daily lives are framed by technology, convenience, and luxuries that the medieval peasant could have only dreamed of. Hot water, central heating, refrigeration, smartphones, all of these are staples of our world, yet they were non existent in the time of the peasant. Now, imagine for a moment waking up in the early hours, feeling the cold of a stone or mud floor beneath you, the rough scratch of wool against your skin as you emerge from your straw-filled bed. You have no warm blanket to curl into, no soft mattress to cradle your body. Instead, you must rise early, greet the chill of the air, and face another day filled with relentless work. There is no gentle press of a button to turn on the heating, no easy access to warm food, and no assurance that the day will end with anything other than exhaustion and sore muscles. The world is harsh and survival is never guaranteed. Yet, despite all these challenges, the medieval peasant carried on. They worked the land from sunup to sundown year after year without the modern distractions that fill our lives today. They didn't have the luxury of taking a day off for self-care, hopping into a warm bath, or escaping into a favorite TV show. There was no time for idle conversation or online shopping sprees. Every moment was dedicated to survival, to ensuring that food would be gathered, that animals would be cared for, and that the next generation would have the tools they needed to continue the cycle. And yet in all this toil, there was a quiet strength, a resilience that is almost impossible to fully comprehend in today's world. The medieval peasant didn't just live, they endured. They persevered through the cold, the physical strain, the emotional burdens of family life, and the ever-present uncertainty of survival. They did all of this without the luxury of comfort or escape, that there were no modern medicines to ease the pain of aching joints, no soft cushions to rest on after a long day of hard work. The life of a medieval peasant was a life lived in its rawest form, shaped by the land, the seasons, and the constant struggle to make it through another day. Now, compare this to our modern world. We wake up to the soothing hum of an alarm clock, take our time getting out of bed, and enjoy the luxury of a hot shower. We can pick up our phones and check the weather, see what's trending on social media, or order our groceries without leaving the house. When we feel tired, we can rest, we can relax, we can escape. When we feel hungry, we can order food from anywhere in the world, have it delivered to our doorstep in minutes. When we feel ill, we have doctor's medicine and a whole host of treatments to help us feel better. In many ways, the comparison between the life of a medieval peasant and our own modern lives feels like night and day. We live in a world that has been shaped by the sacrifices and hard work of countless generations before us, and yet we rarely stop to appreciate just how far we've come. The convenience of modern life is a gift that was hard-earned through the struggles of those who lived before us. It's a gift that we often take for granted. But as we reflect on the life of the medieval peasant, we also begin to see something more. There was a certain beauty in their simplicity, in the way their lives were so intricately tied to the rhythms of the earth. They didn't need the distractions of modern life to find meaning. Their meaning was in the work in the family, in the seasons that governed their every move. Every day was a testament to their resilience, to their ability to endure hardship without complaint. And in many ways, this is a kind of strength that we may have lost in our modern convenience-driven world. Imagine how many of us today would fare without our comforts, without access to technology, medicine, or even a simple bed to sleep in. Could we endure the physical labor, the isolation, and the constant worry of survival that the medieval peasant faced every day? Perhaps not as easily as we'd like to think. It's easy to romanticize the past, to look at the medieval world through a lens of curiosity and fascination. But the truth is, the life of a peasant was one of constant struggle, where every day was a fight for survival. And yet they carried on. There was something incredibly resilient about that, even when the odds were stacked against them. Even when the seasons didn't cooperate and the harvest failed, the peasant kept working. They kept planting. They kept tending to their animals. They kept fighting for their families. They had no choice, but they also had no hesitation. Their endurance, their quiet strength, is something that has defined humanity for centuries. It is a strength that we sometimes forget in our modern world, but it is a strength that is still alive in us all. So, as we lie in our comfortable beds tonight, surrounded by the conveniences of modern life, let's take a moment to reflect on the resilience of the medieval peasant. Let's appreciate the comfort and luxury we have now, but also remember the sacrifices and struggles that came before us. It's a reminder that despite all our modern conveniences, we are still connected to the past in ways we may not even realize. The quiet strength of the peasant lives on in us, in the way we face our own struggles and challenges. As you settle into bed, ready to drift off to sleep, think of the peasant who worked the fields under a much harsher sun, whose body bore the toll of years of hard labor, and whose life was shaped by the cycles of the earth. They might not have had the luxuries we do, but they had something just as valuable: resilience, purpose, and an unwavering commitment to their family and their survival. And in the quiet of the night, perhaps we can draw strength from that, knowing that the world has come a long way, and we are a part of that ongoing journey.